The story of the Boleyn sisters is often told through the dazzling, tragic life of Anne Boleyn, the queen who captivated a king and changed the course of English history. But behind Anne's rise and fall lies a far richer and more complex family saga, one that has been overshadowed by the glare of her fame and infamy. Her sisters, especially Mary Boleyn, lived lives marked by ambition, scandal, love, and loss. Stories that have long been hidden in the shadows of history. Exploring their lives not only uncovers forgotten voices but also reveals the fierce realities faced by women navigating the treacherous world of Tudor politics, where reputation could be as powerful as a crown and as fragile as a whisper. This is the untold story of the Sisters of the Queen, women whose lives shaped, and were shaped by, the tumultuous court of Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn's name echoes through the pages of Tudor history as one of its most iconic and tragic figures, a queen who rose meteorically through the ranks of court, captivated a king, and fell to the executioner's axe under charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Her story is often told as a compelling mix of romance, ambition, and downfall, and she continues to fascinate historians, writers, and popular culture centuries after her death. But in the long shadows cast by her dramatic life and death, there remain other women of the Boleyn family, her sisters, whose stories have largely gone untold or have been relegated to footnotes in Anne's larger narrative. Chief among them is Mary Boleyn, Anne's elder sister, often dismissed as little more than a royal mistress and scandalous figure. Yet her life, quiet though it may have appeared, played a critical role in the complex web of Tudor court intrigue. Beyond Mary, there were other female Boleyns, connected through blood and marriage, who too were swept up in the power plays, religious upheavals, and dynastic ambitions of the 16th century. This introduction lays the foundation for exploring their overlooked lives, examining why they matter and what their stories reveal about the era in which they lived. The world of Tudor England was one in which women's lives were often shaped, and in many ways constrained, by the men around them. Fathers, husbands, kings. And yet, women still played pivotal roles in political strategy, courtly influence, and dynastic maneuvering, often behind the scenes and through relationships rather than open power. Anne Boleyn is remembered today in part because her fate was so exceptional. She became queen, challenged the church by breaking with Rome, and mothered Elizabeth I. But Mary Boleyn's story, quieter and more ambiguous, may offer a more typical example of the pathways available to Tudor noblewomen, and the costs of stepping beyond the bounds of expectation. Her relationships, both personal and political, intersected with some of the most consequential figures and events of the period. She was mistress to two kings, married into courtly power, and later risked everything by marrying for love rather than for family advantage. Yet her legacy remains hazy. Unlike Anne, Mary left behind no famous child, no monumental trial, no speeches from the scaffold. Her life is reconstructed mostly through fragments, legal records, property transfers, letters pleading for aid. Even her children, Catherine and Henry Carey, are enveloped in mystery, with questions lingering about their possible royal paternity. Was she a pawn used by her ambitious family, or a woman who pursued her own path in a perilous court? Historians have long debated her motivations, reputation, and the significance of her actions, often coloring their interpretations with the same blend of myth, morality, and gender judgment that cloud Anne's story. But unlike Anne, Mary never had the platform or the peril of queenship, and as a result, her story is much harder to recover. The Boleyns were not always aristocrats. They rose through trade and royal service, gaining titles and land through loyalty and ambition. Thomas Boleyn, the family patriarch, was a career courtier and diplomat who skillfully navigated the dangerous waters of Henry VIII's favor. His marriage to Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the powerful Duke of Norfolk, further anchored the family among the great noble houses of England. Together, Thomas and Elizabeth raised their children, Mary, Anne and George, with the court as the horizon of ambition. Each was groomed for service, influence and marriage, and the daughters in particular were positioned for roles as ladies-in-waiting in foreign and domestic courts. These roles were not merely ceremonial, they were central to how families advanced their status, secured alliances, and influenced the king. It is in these courtly environments, both dazzling and dangerous, that Mary Boleyn first came of age. As a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France, She was exposed to the refined but licentious world of continental courts, where beauty and charm were currency and survival often depended on discretion. She would return to England with a reputation, earned or invented, as a woman of experience. Soon she entered the English court and caught the eye of Henry VIII. Their relationship is poorly documented but widely accepted as fact, though its duration and intensity remain unclear. It was in this period that Mary married William Carey, a rising courtier close to the king, suggesting that Henry may have arranged the match himself, another sign of how courtly roles, romantic entanglements, and political maneuvering were inextricably entwined. The exact nature of Mary's relationship with Henry VIII has fueled speculation for centuries, particularly regarding the paternity of her children. If Henry Carey or Catherine Carey were indeed the king's offspring, then Mary's descendants would have shared royal blood. And indeed, Queen Elizabeth I would have had Boleyn relatives connected to her father in more ways than one. However, Henry VIII never acknowledged any children by Mary, and she herself never publicly claimed such ties. Whether this silence was imposed, strategic, or simply based on truth is unknown. What is clear is that after her husband's death from the sweating sickness in 1528, Mary's situation became increasingly precarious. Without a powerful protector or stable income, and outshone by her younger sister Anne, who by then had begun her own ascent toward queenship, Mary faded from the center of court life. In a decision that would mark a turning point in her life, Mary remarried in secret, choosing a man of lower status, William Stafford. It was a marriage for love, not advantage, an act that scandalized the court and infuriated her sister, now Queen Anne. As punishment, Mary was banished from court and largely abandoned by her family. Her letters from this period, notably one to Thomas Cromwell, reflect both humility and quiet dignity. She described her love for Stafford and her desire for peace over prestige. She asked for help not as a sister to the Queen, but as a woman wronged and in need. These letters are some of the few surviving records in her voice, and they offer a rare window into her inner world, one shaped by personal conviction rather than courtly ambition. What makes Mary's story, and those of other Boleyn women, so important is not that they were extraordinary in the way Anne was, but rather that they embody the complexity, constraints, and contradictions of noble womanhood in Tudor England. They remind us that history is not only made by queens and kings, but also by those who lived at the margins of power, navigating its dangers and opportunities in quieter, more personal ways. Mary's decision to marry for love, her struggle for survival after her family's fall, and her relative erasure from the historical record all point to the limitations of traditional historical narratives, which often privilege public drama over private resilience. Recovering the stories of Mary Boleyn and her female relatives is challenging due to scarce primary sources and their limited presence in historical records. Their voices were often excluded, not from lack of influence, but because the era prioritized male perspectives. Much knowledge about Mary is filtered through men's accounts or later historians' interpretations, sometimes confusing identities like that of Elizabeth Boleyn. Women's histories were shaped by gender biases, focusing more on reputation than strategy. This video seeks to reconstruct the lives of Anne Boleyn's sisters using only publicly available historical sources, recognizing their agency and impact within Tudor society despite historical neglect. The story of the Boleyn family is one of ambition, social mobility, and the intricate dance of politics and court life in Tudor England. Their rise from relatively modest beginnings to a position of significant power and influence at the English court was emblematic of the opportunities and perils of the time. The Boleyns were not always members of the aristocracy. Their journey began in the world of commerce, and it was through careful alliances, advantageous marriages, and loyal service to the crown that they established themselves among the noble elite. This transformation was neither swift nor straightforward, but was the result of generations of strategic positioning and determination. The Boleyn family originally hailed from Norfolk, with roots traceable to the 13th century. However, it was in the 15th century that the family began to acquire wealth and status through trade and mercantile ventures. Geoffrey Boleyn, the great-grandfather of Anne Boleyn, was a prosperous London merchant who served as Lord Mayor of London in 1457. His success enabled the family to purchase Hever Castle in Kent, marking the first significant step towards becoming landed gentry. From there, the family began a steady ascent into the upper echelons of society. Geoffrey's son, William Boleyn, furthered the family's fortunes by marrying Lady Margaret Butler, a daughter of the Irish Earl of Ormond, thus linking the Boleyn name with ancient nobility. This union brought both wealth and a claim to aristocratic lineage, an essential component in the highly hierarchical world of Tudor England. Thomas Boleyn, the son of William and Margaret, was the key architect of the family's rise to national prominence. He was ambitious, educated, and skilled in diplomacy, and he understood the mechanisms of power at court. His career in royal service began under Henry VII and flourished under Henry VIII. He held several important diplomatic posts and was rewarded with titles and lands, becoming Viscount Rochford and later Earl of Wiltshire and Earl of Ormond. However, his ascent was not solely the result of personal merit. His marriage to Elizabeth Howard, daughter of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, was equally instrumental. The Howards were one of the most powerful noble families in England, and this union provided the Boleyns with both prestige and influential connections at court. Elizabeth Howard brought with her a noble pedigree and the expectations that came with it. As a member of the high-ranking Howard family, she would have been raised with a deep understanding of courtly manners, lineage, and the importance of securing advantageous marriages and political alliances. Her marriage to Thomas Boleyn was a calculated move that benefited both families. The Howards cemented an alliance with a rising family rich in royal favor, while the Boleyns gained access to one of the most powerful noble networks in the realm. Elizabeth's own role in the household and her expectations for her children were shaped by her aristocratic upbringing. She was no passive participant. She likely took an active role in managing the education and social preparation of her children, especially her daughters, who were expected to serve as ladies-in-waiting and marry well. The Boleyn household was governed by the strict norms and expectations of noble Tudor families. Sons were groomed for public service, diplomacy, or ecclesiastical roles, while daughters were expected to be accomplished in the courtly arts, maintain virtue and decorum, and serve in noble households as a means of making valuable connections. These placements were not just symbolic, they were strategic. Service at court placed young noblewomen within the orbit of royalty and powerful courtiers, where marriage prospects, political alliances, and family advancement could be negotiated. Within such households, girls learned not only needlework and music but also the subtle skills of court politics, observation, and deference. The children of Thomas and Elizabeth, Mary, Anne, and George, were raised with these expectations in mind. Their education reflected the humanist ideals of the early 16th century, emphasizing languages, classical literature, religious instruction, and courtly accomplishments. Anne and Mary were both taught French, Latin, and possibly some Italian, along with music, dance, embroidery, and the etiquette required of noblewomen. Their brother George was similarly educated, likely under private tutors, with an emphasis on the classical education expected of young noblemen. George would later become a poet and courtier, suggesting a strong intellectual foundation. Much of the Boleyn children's early education likely took place at Hever Castle, their family seat in Kent. However, as was customary among the nobility, they were soon sent to serve in the households of higher-ranking nobles or foreign courts to gain exposure, experience, and connections. Mary Boleyn was likely the first to be sent abroad, probably to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, followed by Anne. This court was renowned for its learning and refinement, and both girls would have been introduced to the latest developments in art, music, and literature. From there, Anne served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France, placing her at one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe. This experience deeply shaped her character, mannerisms, and worldview, giving her a polish and intelligence that would later captivate Henry VIII. The decision to send daughters to foreign courts was more than just educational. It was a strategic move by Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn. The presence of their daughters in such prestigious environments enhanced the family's reputation and ensured that they were in places where they could be noticed by royalty, courtiers, and ambassadors. Court positioning was everything in Tudor England. Noblewomen who served queens and princesses were not only visible but also privy to intimate political and social circles. For the Boleyn daughters, their placements were stepping stones to influence. Mary Boleyn's time at the French court introduced her to powerful individuals and may have been the beginning of her associations with royalty. Anne's court experience, coupled with her intelligence and wit, would later make her a formidable presence in the English court. The early court careers of Anne and Mary highlight the delicate balance between opportunity and danger for noblewomen. Court life was glamorous but perilous. Reputation could be made or destroyed in an instant. The favor of the king could elevate a family to unprecedented heights or cast them into ruin. For Thomas Boleyn, the placement of his daughters was part of a broader strategy to cement the family's place among the aristocracy and to secure lasting power. For Elizabeth Howard, it would have also been a matter of family pride and duty, ensuring that her daughters met the standards expected of Howard women. However, once Anne caught the eye of Henry VIII, the family's fortunes became inextricably tied to the will and whims of the king. The positioning of the Boleyn daughters at court also sheds light on the gender dynamics of the time. Women of noble birth were expected to be attractive, educated, obedient, and virtuous, but they were also expected to be useful. Their marriages were tools of diplomacy. Their presence at court could help win favors or secure titles. Yet, despite these constraints, women like Anne and Mary Boleyn were able to exercise influence in subtle but significant ways. Through conversation, charm, patronage, and proximity to power, they navigated a world dominated by men but not entirely controlled by them. The early years of the Boleyn children, therefore, must be understood not just as a period of personal development but as a critical phase in the family's broader campaign for status. Their upbringing, education, and strategic placement at court were all part of Thomas Boleyn's vision for elevating his family's position. It was a vision shared and supported by Elizabeth Howard, who brought to the marriage not only noble blood but the experience of navigating the highest levels of courtly life. Together, they molded their children into assets for the family's future, a future that would depend on their ability to charm, influence, and, ultimately, survive the volatile world of the Tudor court. While Anne Boleyn's later role as queen would become the defining chapter of the Boleyn legacy, it was built upon the foundation laid during these formative years. Her rise was not a spontaneous act of royal attraction but the culmination of calculated positioning, years of preparation, and the cultivation of the qualities that made her irresistible and dangerous to Henry VIII. Mary's earlier relationship with the king, though less politically consequential, was also a product of the same environment. An environment that trained women to appeal to power and made them valuable commodities in the marriage and political markets. In retrospect, the story of the Boleyn family's rise is not merely the tale of one ambitious man or one captivating woman. It is the story of a family that understood the dynamics of power and used every means at its disposal to climb the social ladder. From the merchant houses of London to the glittering courts of Europe, from private tutors in Kent to diplomatic missions abroad, every choice made by Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn was part of a larger plan. Their children, especially Anne, Mary, and George, were the instruments of that ambition. And while their story would end in both triumph and tragedy, it began with a vision of noble aspiration, carefully nurtured in the quiet corridors of castles and the calculated elegance of courtly life. Mary Boleyn, the elder sister of the more famously remembered Anne Boleyn, remains one of the most enigmatic figures of the Tudor court. Her life is often overshadowed by Anne's meteoric rise and tragic fall, yet Mary's own experiences at court offer a fascinating glimpse into the expectations, dangers, and roles that noblewomen were forced to navigate during the volatile reign of Henry VIII. Though much of her life has been distorted by rumor, speculation, and dramatization, Mary's journey from an ambitious courtier to a woman cast into relative obscurity is rich with nuance and reflects the broader societal and political landscape of early 16th century England and France. Mary was likely born between 1499 and 1500, making her the eldest of the three surviving Boleyn children. As the daughter of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, her early years were shaped by privilege, duty, and the preparation expected of noblewomen. While records of her childhood are sparse, it is evident that she received a typical education for girls of her class, likely including instruction in French, music, dancing, embroidery, and religious studies. Like her siblings, she would have been trained to perform gracefully in courtly settings, understand noble decorum, and be a suitable candidate for marriage or royal service. Her first known court appointment was as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France, wife of King Francis I. This was a prestigious and strategic placement, reflecting her family's increasing prominence and the desire to position their daughters advantageously within European power centers. At the French court, Mary would have been exposed to a vibrant cultural atmosphere filled with art, literature, and intricate political dynamics. The court of Francis I was renowned for its elegance and indulgence, as well as its flirtations and rumors. For a young Englishwoman like Mary, it was both an opportunity and a minefield. Mary's time in France, however, has been the subject of much historical speculation and scandal. It is widely claimed that she became a mistress to King Francis I during her stay at court. Francis allegedly referred to her as his English mare, and is said to have boasted of having ridden her, a crude and demeaning remark that has colored her reputation for centuries. However, it is important to note that much of this narrative is drawn from later accounts and court gossip rather than contemporary documentation. The image of Mary as a promiscuous woman in the French court may have been exaggerated or even fabricated by her enemies or those seeking to discredit the Boleyn family during their period of influence. In a court known for its licentiousness, flirtation was common, and innuendo was often weaponized. While it is possible that Mary did have a brief affair with Francis, the full extent of their relationship remains unclear and may have been no more than rumor. Upon her return to England around 1519, Mary resumed her position within the English court and continued to serve as a lady-in-waiting, likely to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Her reintroduction to court life coincided with the growing prominence of her father, Thomas Boleyn, who was increasingly involved in royal diplomacy and internal politics. Around this time, Mary caught the attention of King Henry VIII. It is believed that she became his mistress in the early 1520s, possibly around 1522 or 1523. Like her supposed liaison with Francis I, this affair has been subject to much historical debate. However, most scholars agree that Mary did become the king's mistress, though for a relatively brief period. Unlike some of Henry VIII's more enduring relationships, such as that with Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour, his connection with Mary was not marked by political ambition or marriage plans. It seems to have been a temporary dalliance, perhaps conducted discreetly or quietly accepted by the court. During this time, Mary married Sir William Carey, a gentleman of the king's household. This marriage was likely arranged with royal favor, perhaps even encouraged by Henry himself, as was common when mistresses needed to be married off for propriety's sake or court diplomacy. William Carey's fortunes rose with the marriage, suggesting that the king provided generous support. The affair with Henry VIII, whether brief or more extended, had consequences for Mary. Her reputation suffered, and in a society that valued female chastity and obedience, being known as the king's mistress could be both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it brought attention and influence to the Boleyn family. On the other, it may have limited Mary's own prospects for future advancement or respectful treatment. Despite her royal liaison, Mary never wielded political influence in the way Anne later would. She remained largely in the background, and her name does not appear frequently in state papers or court records during this time. There has been speculation that one or both of Mary's children, Catherine and Henry Carey, may have been fathered by Henry VIII. However, there is no definitive proof of this, and the king never acknowledged them as his own, as he did with Henry Fitzroy, his illegitimate son by Elizabeth Blunt. Still, the timing of Mary's relationship with Henry and the birth of her children leaves the question open, and some contemporaries may have believed the rumor. Regardless of their paternity, the Carey children later enjoyed royal favor, particularly under Queen Elizabeth I, who elevated Henry Carey to the peerage as Baron Hunsdon, perhaps a nod to a shared Boleyn bloodline, or perhaps a reflection of familial loyalty. Mary's marriage to William Carey was not a particularly happy or long-lasting union. William died of the sweating sickness in 1528, leaving Mary a widow with 2 young children and limited financial means. Her situation became precarious, and she was reportedly left without adequate support. Despite the Boleyn family's increasing power at court due to Anne's growing influence with the king, Mary did not seem to benefit from her sister's favor during this time. In fact, Anne may have distanced herself from Mary, considering her indiscretions and lack of political usefulness. Whether from jealousy, resentment, or the pressures of court politics, and did not offer Mary the protection one might expect from a sister in such a powerful position. Mary's marginalization at court became even more pronounced following her second marriage. In 1534, she secretly wed William Stafford, a soldier of relatively modest background. This union was done without the permission of her family or the king, and it resulted in her banishment from court. And by this time Queen of England was reportedly furious at Mary's perceived disobedience and loss of social decorum. In a society where noble women were expected to marry advantageously and only with approval from their families, Mary's choice was seen as an act of defiance and recklessness. She paid a heavy price for following her heart, being cast out from the court and virtually erased from the political stage. In many ways, Mary Boleyn's story is that of a woman who failed to meet the expectations imposed upon her by her status, family, and gender. She was the elder sister, the one who should have made a respectable match and paved the way for the family's rise. Yet it was and younger and more ambitious, who ultimately fulfilled that role. Mary's early flirtations, real or rumored, and her later decisions placed her outside the bounds of courtly success. Unlike Anne, who carefully constructed her image and used her charm to rise to the highest rank a woman could attain, Mary seemed more passive, more impulsive, and ultimately more vulnerable. Yet there is something poignant and quietly admirable about Mary's trajectory. After the glimmer of court life and the brief glow of royal favor faded, she chose a different path. Her marriage to William Stafford may have cost her status and security, but it was, by all accounts, a love match. In a world where women were often pawns in political games, Mary exercised agency in her own life, even if it meant exile from the world she once inhabited. She lived out the remainder of her years in relative obscurity, far from the grandeur and dangers of court. In retrospect, Mary Boleyn's life underscores the narrow margins available to women of her time. Her experiences demonstrate how quickly a woman's reputation could shift, how limited her options were, and how family ambitions often eclipsed personal desires. While Anne is remembered as a queen, a reformer, and a tragic figure of power, Mary remains the elder sister in the shadows, less calculating, more human, and ultimately cast aside by the very forces that once elevated her. Her story may lack the political drama of Anne's, but it is no less compelling. It reflects the quieter, often overlooked reality of women whose lives did not fit the mold, whose choices placed them outside the spotlight, and who nonetheless endured with a quiet kind of dignity. Mary Boleyn's life continued to unfold in complex and often painful ways after her brief affair with Henry VIII came to an end. Though born into a family rising swiftly through the ranks of the Tudor court, Mary's path diverged sharply from the political ambitions of her relatives. Her first marriage, financial struggles, and eventual fall from royal favor shaped a life marked by both privilege and hardship. Her journey illuminates the challenges faced by noblewomen who navigated both personal desires and familial expectations in a highly stratified and scrutinized world. In 1520, Mary Boleyn married William Carey, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber. He was a man of charm and royal favor, well positioned in court society, and the match initially appeared advantageous for Mary and her family. William was a loyal servant to Henry VIII, and his connection to the king further solidified the Boleyn family's presence within the inner circles of power. Some historians suggest that the timing of this marriage coincided with, or perhaps followed shortly after, Mary's affair with the king, which may have played a role in arranging the union. It was common practice for monarchs to reward or appease former mistresses through favorable marriages, and William Carey's fortunes seemed to rise in tandem with his marriage. The union produced two children, a daughter, Catherine, born around 1524, and a son, Henry, born in 1526. The question of their paternity has long intrigued historians. Though William Carey was the legal and recognized father, speculation persists that one or both children may have been fathered by Henry VIII during his relationship with Mary. The king, however, never acknowledged either child as his own, a stark contrast to his open recognition of his illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, born to Elizabeth Blunt. Still, the notion that Catherine and Henry Carey carried royal blood remained a whispered suggestion throughout their lives and gained traction under Queen Elizabeth I, who showed particular favor to both of them. Elizabeth's patronage of her Boleyn cousins may have stemmed from familial loyalty, shared heritage, or an unspoken acknowledgement of their deeper connection to the Tudor bloodline. Mary's married life with William Carey was not a long one. In 1528, Carey fell victim to an outbreak of the sweating sickness, a mysterious and deadly illness that claimed many lives in Tudor England. His death left Mary a widow with 2 young children and little financial support. Although she was from a wealthy and well-connected family, Mary found herself in a vulnerable position. Carey's estate was not large, and any promises of favor or security tied to Mary's previous relationship with the king seemed to dissipate quickly. She faced growing financial difficulties, a sharp contrast to the increasing power her family was beginning to enjoy through Anne's rising favor with the king. During this period, Anne Boleyn had become a central figure at court and was fast replacing Queen Catherine in Henry's affections. Anne's calculated and strategic approach to her courtship with the king stood in contrast to Mary's earlier, more passive involvement. While Anne carefully guarded her virtue and delayed intimacy to gain greater political leverage, Mary's past as Henry's mistress made her less desirable in a court obsessed with reputation and propriety. Mary's position became increasingly tenuous, as her presence at court served as a reminder of the king's previous affair and potentially undermined Anne's image as a chaste and virtuous alternative to Queen Catherine. Though Anne wielded growing influence, Mary saw little benefit from her sister's rise. In fact, Anne may have deliberately distanced herself from Mary, whose history and lack of ambition did not align with the image and was working to cultivate. It is possible that Anne viewed Mary as a liability, one who had squandered her chance at influence by becoming too accessible to powerful men. While Thomas Boleyn and others in the family capitalized on Anne's closeness to the king, Mary was left to manage her debts and care for her children with little assistance. Amid these challenges, Mary made a bold and highly unusual choice for a woman of her status. In 1534, she secretly married William Stafford, a soldier of relatively modest means. Stafford, a member of the king's garrison, was far beneath Mary in social rank, and their union defied the strict expectations of noble society. Noblewomen, especially widows from prominent families, were expected to remarry strategically, bolstering family alliances or increasing political influence. Mary's marriage to Stafford brought her no such advantages. It was, by all accounts, a marriage for love rather than power. The consequences were swift and severe. When the marriage was discovered, both Mary and Stafford were banished from court. The scandal was compounded by the fact that the marriage had taken place without the knowledge or approval of her family or the king. Anne, now Queen of England, was reportedly furious. Whether her anger stemmed from personal betrayal, concern over the political implications, or wounded pride, she offered no protection or reprieve. The woman who had once shared her childhood and courtly aspirations with Mary now condemned her to obscurity. Mary's exile was not merely a symbolic one. It had real and lasting repercussions. Deprived of court patronage, she and Stafford were forced to live in relative poverty, far from the luxury and influence they had once known. Some evidence suggests that Mary wrote letters pleading for assistance or forgiveness, but if she received any support, it was limited. The Boleyn family, so focused on advancing their political standing, had little time for a sister who had stepped outside the bounds of ambition and decorum. Yet Mary's second marriage reveals much about her character. In a world where women's choices were often dictated by family strategy and dynastic necessity, Mary chose personal happiness over political advantage. This decision, while costly, speaks to a certain courage and independence not always visible in the historical record. It also underscores the limitations placed on women at the Tudor court. While men could rise and fall through boldness and force of will, women were often punished for the same traits, especially if they exercised autonomy in matters of the heart. Mary's later years remain largely undocumented, a quiet postscript to a life once entangled with kings and queens. She and Stafford lived in the English countryside, away from the intrigues and betrayals of court life. She died in 1543, likely in her early 40s, a figure who had seen the height of royal favor and the depths of familial rejection. At the time of her death, her sister Anne had long since been executed, her brother George had been condemned alongside her, and the Boleyn family's star had faded from its once dazzling peak. Though she did not shape policy or change the course of history in dramatic fashion, Mary Boleyn's life remains a compelling narrative of a woman navigating the perils of Tudor society. Her story illustrates how reputation, gender, and family dynamics could determine a woman's fate more than her own intentions or abilities. She stands in contrast to Anne, whose ambition and wit carried her to the throne and ultimately to her death. Mary's choices, some scandalous, some deeply human, remind us that survival often came at the cost of silence and sacrifice. Mary Boleyn was neither saint nor sinner, but a woman of her time, shaped by forces both within and beyond her control. Her children would go on to serve in Queen Elizabeth's court, perhaps the final testament to her legacy. In that sense, Mary's life, quiet and shadowed though it was, had lasting reverberations. Her willingness to step away from courtly ambition and forge her own path, even in obscurity, makes her not only a figure of historical curiosity but also of resilience. Her story, long buried under the more dramatic tales of Anne's rise and fall, deserves its place in the broader tapestry of Tudor history, not as a cautionary tale, but as a portrait of quiet defiance and the enduring complexities of womanhood in an unforgiving age. After being exiled from the English court due to her scandalous marriage to William Stafford, Mary Boleyn faded into the background of Tudor history, a shadow of the ambitious and politically active world she had once been a part of. The glittering halls of power, once within reach, gave way to a quieter, more obscure life, far removed from the intrigues of Henry VIII's court. Despite her noble birth and the high positions of her sister and brother George, Mary lived out her later years with little wealth, diminished influence, and few allies, carving a path that diverged sharply from the trajectory that her family had imagined for her. Living in obscurity with Stafford, Mary found herself distanced not only from courtly life but also from her own family. The Boleyns, now consumed with the courtly maneuverings of Anne's queenship, had little use for a sister who had defied convention and married beneath her station. Although Anne herself had once faced criticism for seeking power through love, her calculated hold on Henry VIII gave her temporary immunity from such accusations. Mary, by contrast, had made no political demands, and her love match was viewed as frivolous and ill-considered. She had transgressed the rules of ambition, not by rising too high, but by stepping away from the ladder altogether. This new life, likely lived in rural seclusion, was a difficult one. Mary and William Stafford were not wealthy, and while they may have possessed some minor lands or income, it would not have been sufficient to support the comfortable lifestyle to which Mary had once been accustomed. Without royal favor, dowry support, or the assistance of her powerful kin, Mary would have had to manage with what little they had. Her social status, once bolstered by her connections to the king and queen, now held little meaning in the practical world of household survival. She was a noblewoman without court, fortune, or influence. Financial pressures weighed heavily on her. In 1534, during the early years of her marriage to Stafford, Mary took the unusual step of writing to Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, to plead for assistance. In her letter, she humbly admitted her disobedience in marrying without permission but begged for compassion and help. She expressed regret, though not shame, over her actions and emphasized her difficult circumstances, the meager means by which she and her husband lived, and the limited future for her children. Her appeal to Cromwell reveals a woman who was not naive, but aware of the political cost of her choices and the need to humble herself to those who held power. Cromwell, however, offered no lasting solution, and Mary remained on the fringes. This act of reaching out was poignant, particularly because of its contrast to Anne's position at the time. While Mary wrote from rural isolation, and was at the pinnacle of power. As queen, she was central to the political and religious transformation of England, playing a key role in Henry's break from Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. The Boleyn name carried unprecedented influence. Their enemies were being driven from court, and their allies rewarded with titles and lands. Mary, meanwhile, lived quietly, a distant relative of the whirlwind of power her sister had unleashed. The sisters' fates had never seemed more divergent. And yet, just a few years later, the contrast would vanish in the most tragic and shocking fashion. In 1536, Anne and George Boleyn were arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The dramatic and brutal fall of the Boleyn family shocked the court and left a stain on the once rising dynasty. Whether Mary heard the news from afar or was drawn closer to London during the unfolding scandal, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that she survived while her siblings perished. and was beheaded on May 19, 1536, George 2 days earlier. Their executions marked not just the end of their lives, but the annihilation of the Boleyn family's political standing. Mary, already ostracized, now stood truly alone. With her parents aging and their fortunes in ruins, she faced the loss of her family's legacy in both a personal and public sense. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, died less than 2 years later, in 1538. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, lived until 1539 but was a diminished figure, forced to reconcile with the destruction of all that he had worked for. The ambitions he had cultivated through his children had come to ruin. Only Mary remained, a forgotten daughter with no remaining platform at court and no position to recover what had been lost. Despite her marginalization, Mary continued to live with dignity. She and William Stafford remained married until her death, and although we know little of their daily lives, there is every indication that their union remained solid. They had no known surviving children together, but Mary's children from her first marriage, Catherine and Henry Carey, eventually rose to prominence under Queen Elizabeth I. This return to favor for her offspring may not have benefited Mary directly, but it underscores the lingering importance of her bloodline. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter and Henry VIII's heir, never forgot her Boleyn cousins. She elevated both of them, granting titles and positions that reflected not only her personal loyalty but perhaps an unspoken recognition of the complex family web from which they sprang. Mary's final years remain largely undocumented. It is likely that she died in 1543, although exact records are absent. She would have been in her early 40s, middle-aged by Tudor standards but not yet old. Her death passed without fanfare, and she left behind no writings, no recorded public words, no estate of grand value. Unlike her sister Anne, whose name was etched into history through both triumph and tragedy, Mary's life closed with little ceremony. She was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten. And yet, in the centuries that followed, Mary Boleyn's story has continued to fascinate. Her quiet endurance, her scandalous love affairs, her ambiguous role in the royal line, all have inspired fiction writers, filmmakers, and historians alike. She is often portrayed as the softer, gentler Boleyn sister, the one who loved rather than schemed, who survived rather than ascended. In novels and films, her image vacillates between tragic heroine and passive bystander. Some portray her as a pawn in family games, while others imagine her as a rebel who chose love over duty. These portrayals often reflect modern sensibilities more than historical fact. The Mary Boleyn of history left few traces of her own voice. She did not write letters of state, leave memoirs, or take part in major events beyond her relationships with powerful men. Much of what we know has been inferred through others' actions or through the political consequences of her choices. Nevertheless, her role, though peripheral in the grand narrative of Tudor England, remains essential to understanding the complexity of women's lives during this time. Mary's story is ultimately one of survival. She outlived her more famous siblings, endured disgrace and exile, and raised children who would reclaim some measure of the family's lost legacy. Though she did not wield the pen or the sword, her life raises questions about the nature of power, the constraints of gender, and the cost of stepping outside expected roles. Her survival was not one of ambition fulfilled but of quiet resilience. In a court where visibility meant influence, Mary's disappearance seems like defeat. Yet, perhaps there is a different way to understand it. While others died for ambition or were destroyed by proximity to power, Mary chose a different path. She married for love, accepted the consequences, and endured a life far removed from the glittering heights she might once have imagined. Her obscurity may not have been her wish, but it may also have been her salvation. The long view of history has a way of reassessing its forgotten figures. In Mary Boleyn's case, her obscurity has made her a canvas upon which generations have projected their ideas about love, loyalty, and loss. Her story is not just about the Tudor court but about the choices that define a life. Those made in silence, outside the gaze of history, but no less powerful for their quiet endurance. Elizabeth Howard Boleyn, born into the powerful and ancient Howard family, played a formative role in the rise and eventual downfall of one of the most infamous families in Tudor history. As the daughter of Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, She carried the dignity of a noble lineage that extended far back into the English aristocracy. Her upbringing, steeped in the courtly culture of the late 15th century, would have included training in the expectations of noble womanly decorum, religious instruction, music, and manners suited for a lady destined for influence. She was born into a world that expected women of her rank to perform a delicate balancing act, devoted in marriage, polished in courtly life, and silently strong in politics. Elizabeth's marriage to Thomas Boleyn, a man whose family had risen from merchant stock to gentry and now sought further elevation into the aristocracy, was not unusual for the time. Such unions between old nobility and ambitious, upwardly mobile families were mutually beneficial. The noble side brought name and lineage, while the newer family often contributed political cunning, connections, and wealth. For Thomas, marrying into the Howard dynasty was a strategic masterstroke, enhancing his status at court. For Elizabeth, it meant sharing her family's prestige with a man determined to see his offspring climb ever higher. Their household was marked by ambition and strategy. The union of Elizabeth and Thomas would produce 3 children who were destined to shape English history: Mary, Anne, and George. In the world they were born into, a family's advancement often rested upon its daughter's success at court. Elizabeth, therefore, took an active role in ensuring that her daughters were raised with the skills necessary to attract royal favor. While formal records of their education are sparse, the outcomes speak volumes. Anne and Mary were fluent in French, skilled in dance, embroidery, and musical performance, all traits essential for young women presented at the European courts. Elizabeth's own experiences as a lady-in-waiting during the reigns of Elizabeth of York and later Catherine of Aragon provided her with deep insight into the subtle mechanisms of influence, presentation, and politics. It's likely that she passed on these lessons to her daughters, especially Anne, who displayed remarkable poise and ambition from a young age. Whether Elizabeth encouraged Anne's later aspirations for the throne, or merely enabled them by placing her daughters in advantageous courtly roles, remains unknown. What is certain is that she used her family's connections and court knowledge to position her children in ways that allowed them to rise rapidly in the Tudor world. As her children began to assert themselves at court, Elizabeth's role was one of both advisor and guardian. She would have been well aware of the dangers and opportunities in royal favor. Mary Boleyn was the first to enter the court of France as a lady-in-waiting, and then into Henry VIII's circle, eventually becoming his mistress. Elizabeth may have viewed this relationship as scandalous, but also as a potentially useful alliance. However, Mary's eventual fall from favor and her socially inappropriate second marriage to William Stafford would have disappointed and perhaps even embarrassed her mother, who valued social protocol and the preservation of family standing. Anne's rise, by contrast, would have brought both pride and intense anxiety. From the moment Anne caught Henry VIII's attention, Elizabeth must have known that their family was entering dangerous territory. The English court was a volatile place, where proximity to the king could lead to great power or sudden ruin. As Anne resisted becoming merely another royal mistress and held out for marriage, the stakes climbed higher. Elizabeth, familiar with the inner workings of court life, would have understood the delicate dance required to maintain such a precarious relationship with the king. Her support and advice would have been invaluable to and during this period of pursuit and negotiation. As Anne's star rose, Elizabeth's position likewise became more visible. She was present at key moments in her daughter's ascent, likely at Anne's coronation in 1533, where the family's success was at its zenith. Her son George was made Viscount Rochford, her daughter was Queen of England, and her husband was Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond. These were extraordinary rewards, affirming that the Boleyns had become one of the most powerful families in the land. For Elizabeth, these moments must have seemed like the culmination of a life devoted to strategy, duty, and family advancement. However, success came at a price. The court was rife with resentment, and the Boleyns made many enemies. Anne's inability to produce a male heir, coupled with her outspoken manner and strong-willed personality, turned many against her. Henry's affections waned. The same traits that had drawn him to and now repelled him. Elizabeth, watching from within the court, would have seen the shift in the air. There are no recorded letters or statements from her at this time, but one can imagine her concern and helplessness as the political tides turned ominously. In May 1536, disaster struck. George was arrested first, followed quickly by Anne. Both were charged with treason, adultery, and, most horrifyingly, incest. These charges were not just grotesque exaggerations but calculated political assassinations. Elizabeth, by now in her mid-50s, saw her children taken from her in a matter of days. She is not recorded as being present at their trials or executions, which may have been a mercy. Nevertheless, the psychological torment of watching her children condemned by the very court she had once served must have been unbearable. The fall of Anne and George was swift and brutal. On May 17, George was executed. 2 days later, and was beheaded on Tower Green. Their deaths not only shattered the Boleyn family's standing but also destroyed the hopes Elizabeth had nurtured for decades. Thomas Boleyn, who had pushed his children toward courtly success with tireless ambition, retreated into a shell of grief and disgrace. Elizabeth, who had raised and guided them, now bore the unique anguish of a mother who had outlived her children and witnessed their public destruction. In the aftermath of the executions, Elizabeth withdrew from public life. Her grief was said to be profound, though few records remain to chronicle her final years. The once grand Boleyn household was subdued, stripped of its prestige and influence. She died in 1538, just 2 years after the deaths of Anne and George. Some accounts suggest she passed away at Hever Castle, the family's ancestral home, possibly from a broken heart. The silence surrounding her final days contrasts sharply with the tumult that had defined the latter part of her life. Despite the tragedy that marked her legacy, Elizabeth Boleyn's influence did not vanish entirely. Through her grandson, Henry Carey, and granddaughter, Catherine Carey, children of Mary Boleyn, her bloodline lived on. These descendants would be welcomed at the court of Elizabeth I, Anne's daughter, who never forgot her mother's family. Elizabeth I favored the Careys, elevating them to positions of trust and authority, suggesting that even though the Boleyn name had been tainted in her father's reign, the Queen honored the legacy of her maternal line. In popular memory, Elizabeth Boleyn remains an enigmatic figure. Overshadowed by her daughter's fame and her husband's ambition, she is often painted as a cold or distant matriarch, perhaps due to the lack of surviving records that reflect her inner life. Fictional portrayals sometimes depict her as harsh, ambitious, or politically calculating, while others imagine her as a heartbroken mother powerless to protect her children from the dangers of court life. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. She was a woman of her time, pragmatic, strategic, and guided by duty. Her motivations may have blended maternal care with political awareness, love with obligation. Her legacy is complex. Elizabeth Boleyn was a critical architect behind the positioning of her children at court, especially Anne. She instilled in them the courtly skills and ambition that brought them success, and she stood by them even as their fates darkened. While history often remembers the Boleyns for their downfall, it is worth considering the path that led there, the vision and effort of a mother who believed her children could shape history. They did, though not as she may have hoped. Elizabeth Boleyn's story is one of strength, sacrifice, and sorrow. She lived through the extraordinary rise of her family, only to see it unravel through betrayal and royal whim. Her dignity in the face of tragedy, her role as mother to some of the most controversial figures of the Tudor era, and her silent endurance during the court's cold judgment mark her as a woman of immense resilience. Though the records do not speak her voice, her influence echoes through the lives she shaped and the legacy her descendants carried forward into the Elizabethan age. In the elaborate theatre of the Tudor court, women played roles both seen and unseen, walking the fine line between influence and submission, visibility and silence. Among these women were figures like Mary and Anne Boleyn, whose stories have been shaped by scandal, ambition, and tragedy. But beyond the dramatized events and individual personalities lies a more intricate reality. A world where courtly women maneuvered within rigid patriarchal frameworks, serving as attendants, messengers, lovers, and sometimes pawns. These women were not mere background figures in a male-dominated court but key players in a constant interplay of politics, personal ambition, and social survival. Women like Mary and Anne did not find themselves at court by accident. Their presence there was a product of careful family planning and strategic maneuvering. For ambitious noble families, placing daughters in the service of queens, duchesses, or foreign courts was a calculated decision. The position of a lady-in-waiting offered far more than access to wealth or fashionable clothing. It was a foothold into the highest circles of power. The court was a dynamic, dangerous place, and a woman's beauty, charm, wit, and ability to adapt could determine the trajectory of her entire family's fortunes. Mary Boleyn began her court life in France, serving Queen Claude, the wife of Francis I. In this setting, she was exposed to the flamboyant French court, a place known for its sophistication, sensuality, and political undercurrents. Though often remembered for her alleged affairs, Mary's experience in France also helped shape her courtly demeanor and social skills, which would later aid her when she returned to England. And her younger sister followed a similar path, but her court service included time with Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands before moving on to France. This exposure to European courts refined Anne's tastes, sharpened her political instincts, and gave her a cosmopolitan polish that set her apart from many English courtiers. The duties of ladies-in-waiting were varied, often mundane, and always bound by etiquette. They dressed their mistresses, accompanied them during public appearances, and attended them during private moments. They provided companionship, ensured their safety, and maintained their schedules. However, the physical tasks were only a small part of their work. Far more critical was their presence in the background of great events, silent observers and often participants in the personal and political drama of court life. Their words carried weight, whispered in corridors or private chambers, and could build or break reputations. Court life was a maze of political intrigue, and women had to be alert to every nuance. They were constantly watched, not just by rivals, but by those who sought to use them for political advantage. A misplaced word or an inappropriate glance could bring disgrace. Within this environment, the Boleyn sisters learned how to walk the fine line between allure and respectability. Mary's position as mistress to powerful men like King Francis I and Henry VIII may have granted her temporary attention, but it came at the cost of reputation. Anne, learning from this, took a different approach. She withheld physical intimacy from Henry VIII, compelling him to pursue her as a future queen rather than a passing mistress. Her refusal transformed her from a court beauty to a figure of political consequence. Despite their different tactics, both sisters used what agency was available to them. Female agency in the Tudor court did not manifest as open rebellion or challenge to male authority, but in strategic compliance, careful persuasion, and the ability to wield influence from the shadows. Women advanced through their associations, whether with a queen, a noble family, or the king himself. Their relationships, conversations, and behavior were all tools of negotiation. In this realm, even romantic entanglements were rarely matters of the heart alone. Love at court was often transactional, with women marrying or becoming mistresses to secure their family's future or to gain titles, land, or influence. This does not mean that emotions were absent. Love, jealousy, fear, and grief were all very real, but they were inextricably bound with political consequence. Mary Boleyn's marriage to William Carey was appropriate and advantageous at the time, given Carey's closeness to Henry VIII. However, her later marriage to William Stafford, a man far beneath her in rank, stripped her of status and pushed her into obscurity. That she married for love rather than advancement marked her as a woman of rare defiance, but it also cost her everything she had once gained. It was a bold move in a world where women were expected to marry not for themselves but for the advantage of others. And, by contrast, played the courtly game to its fullest. She flirted with princes, danced before kings, and inspired poets, not by accident but by design. Her rise to queen was not merely the result of Henry VIII's obsession, but also of Anne's own resolve and intelligence. She knew the risks, yet she believed in her power to influence policy, religion, and the king himself. And for a time, she succeeded. As queen, she placed her own allies in powerful positions, pushed for reform in the church, and tried to mold the future of England. But her failure to produce a male heir, combined with the enmity of traditionalists and political rivals, proved fatal. The fates of Mary and Anne Boleyn contrast with those of other court women who navigated the same treacherous terrain. Take, for example, the Seymour sisters. Jane Seymour, who succeeded Anne as queen, took a quieter, more submissive approach. Where Anne was fiery and opinionated, Jane was mild and obedient, a personality cultivated to attract a king who had grown weary of Anne's boldness. Jane's reward was a crown and the birth of a long-awaited male heir, but she died shortly after, remembered more for her virtue than her politics. Jane's sisters, too, played the courtly game. Anne Seymour became Duchess of Somerset and wielded considerable influence during the minority reign of Edward VI. Their successes and failures mirrored those of the Boleyn sisters, but with less drama and fewer public consequences. The contrast speaks to the variety of strategies available to women at court. Some chose boldness, others retreated into piety or silence. All, however, navigated a world in which their fates were deeply tied to the ambitions of their male relatives and the whims of the king. Beyond individual examples, the lives of ladies-in-waiting in the Tudor era were marked by a broader paradox. They were among the most privileged women in England, well-dressed, well-fed, and often well-educated. Yet their freedoms were limited, their futures uncertain, and their reputations fragile. Courtly women were expected to embody virtue while remaining desirable, to be seen but not to speak too freely, to inspire love but not to act upon it unless sanctioned. They lived in proximity to power without ever truly holding it, and they bore the consequences of decisions made by the men around them. Despite these constraints, many women carved out spaces of personal strength. They formed networks, alliances of sisters, cousins, and friends who shared information, protected one another's interests, and offered emotional support. Some maintained correspondence with influential men, leveraging private letters into political advantage. Others ensured their sons and daughters married well, thereby extending their family's reach into future generations. In these ways, women exercised a quiet, often overlooked form of power. The Boleyn sisters, with their contrasting fates, exemplify both the potential and peril of female agency in the Tudor court. Mary, though remembered as the less ambitious sibling, made the daring choice to live on her own terms, ultimately prioritizing love and personal peace over wealth and influence. And, in contrast, pushed the boundaries of what was possible for a woman in her era. She rose higher than nearly any other court lady, becoming queen and influencing national policy, but paid with her life when she could not maintain her footing in the precarious world of royal favor. Their stories are not isolated but reflect the broader experience of courtly women in Tudor England, complex, courageous, and constrained. They operated in a world that both elevated and threatened them, where beauty could open doors and intelligence could be a liability. Yet within this world, they found ways to survive, to love, to strategize, and to leave legacies that continue to fascinate. Through their lives, we glimpse the dynamics of female power in a time when power was assumed to be a man's domain. We see the mechanisms of courtship and patronage, the tensions between duty and desire, and the high cost of ambition. The ladies-in-waiting of Henry VIII's court were not simply background figures in the stories of kings and ministers. They were essential threads in the fabric of Tudor political life, and their stories deserve to be told with the nuance, detail, and respect they command. The court may have been ruled by men, but it was women who mastered its secrets, shaped its culture, and endured its cruelties. In the story of the Boleyn family, much has been written about the glittering rise and tragic fall of Anne Boleyn, the mistress-turned-queen who captivated Henry VIII and changed the course of English history. Her sister Mary has been cast in romantic shadows, remembered for her liaisons with powerful men. Their brother George, too, finds space in the annals of Tudor memory. But behind these central figures was a web of lesser-known women, forgotten female Boleyns, whose lives, marriages, and loyalties helped shape and extend the reach of their ambitious family. These women have remained largely invisible in the historical record, their names often reduced to footnotes or obscured entirely by the fame or infamy of their more prominent kin. Yet their presence, choices, and connections were deeply intertwined with the political tapestry of the Tudor court. The Boleyn family did not emerge out of obscurity without the strategic efforts of multiple generations. Their influence was constructed through a network of marriages and alliances, many of which were brokered by or through women. Among these lesser-remembered women were aunts, cousins, and female in-laws whose contributions, while not as publicly documented, were vital in building the scaffolding on which the more visible Boleyns stood. Women like Cecilia Boleyn, Margaret Boleyn, and others, daughters and wives situated across the extended family tree, formed the connective tissue of the Boleyn legacy, particularly in the early years of their rise. Cecilia Boleyn, sometimes referred to in genealogical records as a quiet but respected family matron, played her part in securing familial stability through marriage and child-rearing. While direct evidence of her actions at court is scant, her presence within the network of Boleyn-Howard relations suggests she occupied a position of trust and influence within the family's inner circle. Women like her served as the bedrock of noble families, ensuring the continuation of bloodlines, arranging matches for their children, and managing household affairs that had political implications. Although these tasks were private and rarely chronicled in court records, they were critical to the maintenance of status and the advancement of familial ambitions. Margaret Boleyn, grandmother to Mary, Anne and George, offers a particularly interesting lens through which to view the hidden agency of Boleyn women. Born Margaret Butler, she came from a powerful Irish noble family and brought with her significant inheritance claims. Her marriage to William Boleyn helped cement the family's rise in England. Though little is known about her personal beliefs or personality, her position as matriarch meant she likely played a role in shaping the early ambitions of her son Thomas Boleyn, and indirectly, her grandchildren. In an age where land and bloodline determined power, Margaret's union with William was not merely domestic, it was political, and her lineage added weight to the Boleyn claim to influence. Beyond these central figures were other lesser-known female relatives whose names appear sporadically in records. Distant cousins, nieces, and female in-laws were often placed in strategic marriages to secure alliances with other noble houses. Such unions served to expand the Boleyn network across the realm, ensuring that the family had sympathetic ears and potential supporters in multiple courts and counties. These women, by virtue of their connections and their expected roles as wives and mothers, became instruments of diplomacy and influence, long before their better-known relatives reached the apex of royal favor. What makes the stories of these women especially poignant is how little is known about them. They lived in the shadows of history, often excluded from chronicles unless they found themselves at the center of scandal or dramatic political events. Unlike men, whose careers at court, military exploits, or appointments were routinely documented, women's lives were primarily recorded in relation to their husbands or fathers. As such, the forgotten Boleyn women fall into that broad, frustrating category of historical invisibility, present, even pivotal, but largely unacknowledged. Part of this obscurity is a reflection of the limitations of the historical record. Women's contributions, especially in the domestic, familial, and social spheres, were not always deemed significant enough to record. Letters were lost, household accounts were destroyed, and chroniclers, often male, paid little attention to the daily lives of noblewomen unless those lives intersected with royalty or scandal. It is likely that many of these women were deeply involved in arranging advantageous matches, managing estates, or even corresponding with political figures, yet the lack of surviving documentation means that their stories can only be partially reconstructed, and often with great difficulty. The Boleyns were not an isolated family, however, and their rise was intimately tied to their alliance with the powerful Howard family, one of the most influential noble houses of Tudor England. Through Elizabeth Howard, Anne and Mary's mother, the Boleyn children inherited a connection to the Dukes of Norfolk, which elevated their social standing considerably. This Howard link brought them into close proximity with other significant female figures of the age, including the formidable Agnes Tilney, the Duchess of Norfolk. A commanding presence at court, Agnes Tilney exemplified the ways in which noblewomen could wield substantial influence within their households and beyond. She played a central role in managing the complex Howard estates, and was involved in the education and placement of young female relatives within the court. It is through women like Agnes Tilney that we can better understand the ecosystem in which the Boleyn women operated. The Duchess helped raise and position many young Howard and Boleyn girls for service in royal households, ensuring their visibility to the king and his courtiers. These placements were not acts of charity. They were strategic investments, designed to secure the favor of the monarch and to insert loyal family members into key positions. For instance, it was under her patronage that women like Catherine Howard, later Queen, found their initial footing in the court. It is likely that many Boleyn girls benefited similarly, groomed for court life under the guidance of matriarchs like Agnes, who understood both the potential rewards and the considerable dangers of courtly ambition. The intersection of these female lives with Tudor politics is subtle yet profound. Women were not only wives and mothers but messengers, matchmakers, and mediators. Through their conversations, correspondences, and quiet influence, they could shape decisions, influence inheritances, and determine alliances. In a court where personal relationships often dictated policy, a strategically placed woman could change the course of events simply through her proximity to power. The Howard-Boleyn alliance, brokered and maintained in part through these female bonds, created a family web that was nearly impossible to untangle. When Anne Boleyn became queen, she brought with her not only personal ambition but an entire network of relatives, many of whom owed their positions to the complex arrangements made by women years earlier. Ladies-in-waiting, maids of honor, and female relatives filled her household, reinforcing her status and providing her with trusted confidants. In this way, the lesser-known Boleyn women played a crucial role in consolidating and maintaining her queenship. Yet this same network became a liability when the Boleyns fell from favor. After Anne's arrest and execution, many of the women associated with her, including those who had only distant familial ties, found themselves under suspicion. The fall of one woman could bring down dozens. The Tudor court was as quick to punish as it was to elevate, and the collapse of the Boleyn faction revealed just how interconnected and vulnerable these women had become. Some retreated into private life, others faded from the record entirely, their lives once again subsumed into the general anonymity of history. The forgotten female Boleyns were not mere spectators in a male-driven world. They were participants in a complex system of familial ambition, social mobility, and political intrigue. Their roles, though often undocumented, were essential to the functioning of the court and the rise of their family. They carried the burden of their family's expectations, navigated the hazards of courtly reputation, and sacrificed personal desires for dynastic goals. Some may have lived quietly, content with domestic life and relative obscurity. Others may have dreamed of greater influence but were denied the opportunity by fate, marriage, or politics. As we attempt to reconstruct the fuller picture of Tudor history, it becomes increasingly important to look beyond the headline figures. For every Anne Boleyn who changed the course of English history, there were dozens of other women. Mothers, cousins, sisters, who supported, influenced, and shaped the environment that made her rise possible. These forgotten women may never have worn a crown, but their legacies endure in the silent architecture of power, family, and sacrifice that defined one of the most dramatic chapters of English history. Theirs is not a story of spectacular ascent or tragic downfall, but one of steady presence and enduring significance. They remind us that history is not only shaped by those who make the loudest noise or meet the most dramatic ends. Sometimes it is shaped just as deeply by those who, from the periphery, helped lay the groundwork for the ambitions of others. Women who quietly built dynasties, managed households, forged alliances, and endured the shifting fortunes of a volatile court. Their names may be faint, their voices distant, but their impact remains etched in the deeper narrative of Tudor England. In Tudor England, society was a carefully woven tapestry of hierarchy, expectation, and appearance, and at its core lay a rigid set of moral codes, particularly for women. Reputation was everything. A noblewoman's worth was often measured not by her talents or intellect but by her chastity and obedience. Men, on the other hand, navigated this world with an entirely different set of expectations and consequences. Nowhere is this imbalance more clearly illustrated than in the lives of women like Mary Boleyn, whose experiences shed light on the severe double standards imposed on women, especially regarding sexuality, scandal, and power. Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne and once a member of the English court, became infamous for her rumored affairs with powerful men, including King Henry VIII and, possibly earlier, the French king, Francis I. Though such liaisons might have increased her family's visibility and political clout, Mary herself bore the full weight of scandal. Unlike her male counterparts, who were often admired for their sexual exploits, Mary was whispered about in contemptuous tones. Her name, even centuries later, is often paired with words like mistress, fallen, or disgraced, whereas men with similar or more flagrant behavior were admired for their virility and charm. The Tudor world, like so many patriarchal systems, celebrated male desire while punishing female sexuality. This inequity was not just social. It was deeply legal and moral. A woman's virginity before marriage was seen as a commodity, something to be guarded, passed from father to husband. Once tarnished, whether by consent or force, a woman could find herself ostracized, her marriage prospects ruined, and her name stained beyond redemption. Mary Boleyn, despite her noble birth and familial connections, was never able to fully rehabilitate her reputation after her affairs. While her liaisons may have been orchestrated or tolerated by her family for political gain, it was Mary alone who bore the moral consequences. Contrast this with the behavior of men in similar positions. Kings and nobles were expected, almost encouraged, to take mistresses. Their virility was a symbol of strength, a kind of courtly performance of masculinity. Henry VIII, for example, openly acknowledged and rewarded mistresses like Bessie Blunt. Bessie, mother to the king's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, was not shunned but elevated, her son even given a dukedom and groomed for a possible role in the succession. Rather than disgrace, Bessie's affair with the king enhanced her status. Mary Boleyn, who may have borne Henry children, though never officially recognized, received no such honor or acknowledgement. Her relationships were kept vague and then eventually erased from court memory. Anne Boleyn's case also illustrates how female sexuality was weaponized. When Anne caught the king's attention, her refusal to become another mistress was a strategic move, whether made by her, her family, or both, to elevate herself beyond the fate of her sister. Yet even as she ascended to queenship, her past flirtations and relationships were used against her. The charges of adultery, incest, and treason that led to her execution were likely exaggerated or entirely fabricated. Yet they found traction because of the prevailing belief that a woman's sexuality was dangerous, threatening, and ultimately ungovernable. The contrast between how Anne and Mary were treated, one condemned for ambition, the other scorned for desire, reflects how deeply ingrained the double standard was. A man could father children outside of wedlock, take mistresses openly, and still be seen as honorable. A woman, even with far less agency in such matters, would be forever tainted. Her character would be judged not on kindness, intelligence, or loyalty, but on whether she had upheld a narrow and unforgiving code of sexual conduct. This standard extended into the institution of marriage itself. While noble and royal men often used marriage as a political tool, discarding wives when expedient, as Henry VIII did repeatedly, women were bound by duty, loyalty, and silence. Mary Boleyn, after her fall from royal favor, married a soldier, William Stafford, for love. This marriage, made without her family's approval and to a man of lesser rank, resulted in her exile from court. Her brother George reportedly called her a fool, and she lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity. Her attempt to assert personal choice in marriage was seen not as romantic, but as disgraceful. Such a move might have been noble for a man, but for Mary, it was interpreted as further evidence of poor judgment and impetuosity. Even when it came to children, especially illegitimate ones, the system was riddled with hypocrisy. If a nobleman fathered a child out of wedlock, he might recognize and support the child. The child might even receive titles or lands, as in the case of Henry Fitzroy. But an illegitimate child born to a woman, particularly one not married, cast shame upon her name forever. The identity of Mary Boleyn's children has long been debated, with some historians speculating that one or both may have been fathered by Henry VIII. Yet, unlike Bessie Blunt's son, they were never acknowledged. The possibility remained a rumor, one that hung over Mary's legacy like a veil of ambiguity. Redemption, too, was gendered. Men could recover from scandal through valor in battle, political achievement, or royal favor. Women had far fewer paths. A quiet retirement, a nunnery, or marriage to a discreet husband might salvage some sense of respectability, but even then, their reputations would never fully heal. Mary Boleyn's life after her scandal involved withdrawal, motherhood, and a marriage of love, yet history continues to remember her more for her sins, real or imagined, than for her resilience. The Tudor court was a stage, and every move was judged with brutal intensity. For women, particularly those of noble birth, the stage was unforgiving. Their value was often determined by their proximity to male power and their ability to preserve appearances. Sexuality, rather than being seen as a natural part of life, was treated as a tool or weapon, glorified in men and condemned in women. This double standard was not unique to the Boleyns, but their story highlights its cruelty with remarkable clarity. Comparisons to other women at court underscore this point. While Mary Boleyn was cast aside and forgotten, other royal mistresses like Elizabeth Blunt found themselves rewarded. Jane Seymour, who succeeded Anne as queen, managed to preserve her virtue and image of quiet obedience and was exalted for it, even though she served the same courtly system that devoured and cast out Mary. These comparisons are not about personal morality but about perception and politics. Women were judged not solely on what they did, but how their actions could be interpreted, used, or manipulated by others, especially men in power. In the end, the treatment of women like Mary and Anne Boleyn serves as a haunting reminder of the cost of navigating a world built on male dominance and sexual hypocrisy. They were not simply victims of personal scandal. They were victims of a broader system that allowed men to dictate morality, while holding women hostage to ideals they rarely had the power to define or resist. Mary's life, full of missteps and quiet courage, is not a tale of disgrace, but one of survival in a world rigged against her. Her choices, however flawed by the standards of her time, were fundamentally human. Yet history has seldom afforded her that grace. As we reflect on the legacies of these women, we must question not just what they did, but how their stories have been told, shaped, and judged. The Tudor double standard was not just a reflection of personal biases, but a deeply embedded societal structure that dictated who was remembered with honor, and who was discarded with shame. Women like Mary Boleyn remind us of the quiet injustice in historical memory, a memory that too often forgets the humanity behind scandal and the strength behind survival. In the realm of historical fiction, few figures have been as polarizing and misrepresented as Mary Boleyn. While her sister Anne has been the subject of extensive scholarly and popular attention, Mary's story has often been overshadowed, distorted, or romanticized. This disparity in representation raises critical questions about how historical women are portrayed in literature and media, and the implications of these portrayals on our understanding of the past. Mary Boleyn's most prominent depiction in contemporary culture comes from Philippa Gregory's novel The Other Boleyn Girl and its subsequent film adaptations. In these works, Mary is portrayed as the innocent, virtuous sister, coerced into an affair with King Henry VIII, while Anne is depicted as the ambitious and manipulative sibling. This dichotomy simplifies the complex realities of both women's lives and reduces them to archetypal figures, the Madonna and the seductress. Such portrayals not only misrepresent historical facts but also reinforce gendered stereotypes that have long been used to control and define women's roles in society. Historians have challenged these fictionalized accounts, emphasizing the lack of concrete evidence regarding Mary's relationships and character. While it is documented that she had an affair with Henry VIII, details about the nature of their relationship and Mary's personal feelings remain speculative. By presenting Mary as a passive victim or a romantic heroine, these narratives strip her of agency and overlook the possibility that she may have made strategic choices within the constraints of her time. The focus on Anne Boleyn in popular culture further marginalizes Mary's story. Anne's dramatic rise and fall, culminating in her execution, provide a compelling narrative that has been explored in numerous films, television series, and books. While Anne's life undoubtedly offers rich material for storytelling, the disproportionate attention she receives compared to her sister reflects broader societal tendencies to prioritize sensational stories over nuanced ones. This imbalance contributes to the erasure of women's diverse experiences and reinforces a narrow understanding of their roles in history. The romanticization or vilification of historical women like Mary and Anne Boleyn has significant consequences. By casting them in simplistic roles, we risk perpetuating myths that obscure the complexities of their lives and the societal structures that shaped their choices. Such portrayals can also influence contemporary perceptions of women's capabilities and reinforce outdated notions of femininity and morality. Mary Boleyn, once dismissed merely as the other Boleyn girl, or relegated to the role of a royal mistress with little agency, is now being re-examined with fresh eyes. Scholars are probing archival records, letters, and contemporary accounts to reconstruct a life far more complex than popular fiction has allowed. While many questions remain about her relationships, especially her supposed affairs with Henry VIII and King Francis I, there is growing consensus that Mary was a figure navigating the perilous and often ruthless waters of Tudor court life with more acumen than previously credited. Her decisions, whether personal or political, were shaped by a desire for survival and status in a society where women's fortunes were inextricably tied to their male relatives and court favor. The legacy of Mary and the other Boleyn women is intricately linked with their children, whose bloodlines carried far-reaching implications for the Tudor dynasty and beyond. Mary's children with William Carey, Catherine and Henry Carey, have long been the subject of speculation regarding their paternity. Some historians suggest that Henry VIII may have fathered one or both children, which, if true, would embed Mary's line within the royal bloodline. Regardless of this uncertainty, the Careys rose to prominence in Elizabethan England, with Henry Carey becoming a notable courtier and a trusted figure in Queen Elizabeth I's reign. This connection demonstrates how the personal relationships and political maneuverings of the Boleyn family resonated well beyond the immediate Tudor court, influencing the course of English history. The question of legitimacy and bloodlines in the Tudor period was not merely a matter of genealogy but one deeply intertwined with power, inheritance, and political stability. The Boleyn sisters' stories reveal much about these preoccupations, particularly as royal favor and court intrigue constantly reshaped alliances and fortunes. Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII and her subsequent execution are often seen as emblematic of the perilous intersection of personal ambition and dynastic politics. Meanwhile, Mary's quieter life, punctuated by scandal and exile, illustrates the fragile status of women whose fortunes depended largely on their ability to navigate these treacherous dynamics. Through the lens of the Boleyn family, historians gain insight into Tudor society's rigid hierarchies, gender expectations, and the volatile nature of power at court. The sisters' experiences underscore the limited options available to women of noble birth, where marriage, court positions, and relationships with powerful men often dictated their social standing and security. They also highlight the double standards women faced regarding sexuality, reputation, and agency, issues that resonate with contemporary discussions about gender and power. Modern historical reclamation efforts emphasize the importance of recovering these lost or silenced voices, recognizing that history has too often been written from a male perspective that sidelines women's contributions and experiences. The Boleyn sisters, once peripheral figures in Tudor history, are now being brought into sharper focus not only as individuals but as representatives of the broader struggles and achievements of women in their era. This reclamation involves reinterpreting sources with a critical eye, questioning long-held assumptions, and challenging the narratives that have romanticized or vilified these women without fully understanding their complexities. This process also speaks to the wider imperative of rewriting history to include those who have been historically marginalized, not just women, but also people of different classes, ethnicities, and backgrounds whose stories have been obscured or erased. Writing women like Mary and Anne Boleyn back into the historical record enriches our understanding of the past, providing a more holistic and accurate picture of society and culture. It also offers a corrective to centuries of bias that have shaped popular and academic histories alike. In addition to scholarly work, the resurgence of interest in the Boleyn sisters has influenced popular culture, inspiring new books, documentaries, and discussions that seek to portray these women with greater depth and humanity. This cultural shift helps dismantle the stereotypes and myths that have long defined Mary Boleyn as merely a footnote in her sister's story. Instead, she and the other Boleyn women are increasingly recognized as significant historical figures in their own right, whose lives reflect the complexities of Tudor England and the enduring challenges faced by women in history. Ultimately, the renewed focus on Mary Boleyn and her sisters illustrates how historical narratives evolve and how the act of reclamation serves not only to correct the record, but also to inspire contemporary audiences to reflect on issues of gender, power, and identity. By acknowledging the agency, struggles, and legacies of these women, modern historians contribute to a more inclusive history, one that honors the full spectrum of human experience and offers lessons that remain relevant today. The story of the Boleyn sisters, especially Mary, is one that defies simple categorization. Throughout history, Mary Boleyn has been a figure shrouded in mystery, rumor, and often unfair judgment. Her legacy is complicated, caught between the roles imposed on her by others and the realities of her own life and choices. Unlike her sister Anne, who is remembered as queen and martyr, Mary's story is one of shadows, of a woman who navigated the treacherous Tudor court with less recognition, yet whose influence and experiences are no less important. Understanding Mary's legacy requires us to confront the complexities of her life and the broader social and political forces that shaped it. Mary's complicated legacy is emblematic of how women in Tudor England, especially those connected to power, were often trapped in contradictory positions. As a noblewoman, she was expected to secure her family's status through marriage and court alliances. Yet, as a woman, her reputation was vulnerable to scandal and gossip, especially when involved with powerful men like kings. The rumors of Mary's affairs with King Francis I of France and Henry VIII have long colored her story, sometimes diminishing her to a mere footnote in her sister's ascent. But recent scholarship invites us to view her not just as a passive victim or a scandalous mistress, but as an individual who exercised agency within a restrictive society. Her life shows us the precariousness of female existence in a world dominated by patriarchal power and the difficult choices women had to make to survive and protect their families. Moreover, Mary's experiences highlight the critical role women played in shaping dynastic politics during the Tudor period. While kings and queens often dominate historical narratives, women like Mary and Anne Boleyn were key players behind the scenes. They influenced court alliances, bore children whose legitimacy mattered greatly, and navigated a political landscape fraught with danger and opportunity. The Boleyn sisters' stories underscore that dynastic politics were not merely the affairs of men but deeply intertwined with women's lives, ambitions, and sacrifices. Their roles as wives, mistresses, mothers, and ladies-in-waiting were all pivotal in shaping the political currents of their time. Telling the forgotten stories of women like Mary Boleyn enriches our understanding of history by providing a more balanced and humanized view of the past. These stories illuminate the experiences of individuals who are often marginalized or erased from dominant historical accounts. By recovering Mary's narrative, we gain insight into the daily realities of Tudor women, the limits of their power, and their resilience. It challenges us to rethink traditional histories that focus predominantly on male figures, and to recognize that the lives of women were equally significant in shaping the course of events. Anne Boleyn's dramatic fate as queen, her meteoric rise, the religious upheaval her marriage helped catalyze, and her tragic execution, inevitably overshadows the stories of her siblings. The grand narrative of Anne as a pivotal figure in English history often relegates Mary and their brother George to the background. However, this overshadowing does not erase their existence or diminish their contributions. The lives of Mary and her family members offer important perspectives on the human costs of ambition, power struggles, and court politics. They remind us that history is not just the story of celebrated rulers but also of those who lived in their shadow, endured their consequences, and shaped their legacies in quieter but meaningful ways. In the present day, the untold stories of Mary and her sisters matter more than ever. There is a growing recognition of the importance of inclusive history, one that acknowledges diverse voices and experiences. Mary Boleyn's story invites us to question how histories are constructed, whose stories are told, and which narratives are privileged. It challenges us to confront the gender biases and cultural assumptions that have long influenced historical interpretation. By reclaiming these stories, we not only honor the memory of forgotten women but also enrich our collective understanding of humanity's past. Furthermore, Mary's story resonates with contemporary discussions about women's agency, reputation, and power. Her life reflects ongoing struggles faced by women in balancing societal expectations with personal desires, and navigating systems that often marginalize them. The complexities of her legacy encourage empathy and critical reflection, reminding us that history is made up of real people with multifaceted lives, not just simplified legends or stereotypes. The story of Mary Boleyn and her sisters is a testament to the rich, often overlooked contributions of women to history. Their lives compel us to look beyond the dominant narratives and explore the nuanced realities of the past. By embracing these untold stories, we not only recover lost voices but also deepen our appreciation of the human dimensions of history. Mary's legacy, complicated though it may be, endures as a powerful reminder that history is incomplete without the stories of all who shaped it, especially those who lived in the shadows of queens.